briefly touch upon the ODI regulations, then go to the core about ODI investment by an Indian party. We'll also touch upon ODI investment by an individual under the LRS regime. Talk a bit about round tripping. Talk a bit about the branch operations, some other reporting provisions, and we'll also take up some 6-7 case studies at the end of it. Also do some interplay between the ODI regulations and the Companies Act. So that's how we'll plan our today's talk.
Vishalji, just for your update,
Yes.
yesterday also we had one session on ODI whereby Mr. Shah had covered LRS as far as LRS and ODI is concerned.
Okay.
So I believe you can complement that.
I can, yes, I can then maybe put less emphasis. In any case, the emphasis is more on the Indian party. And the LRS part, I would not then touch it. I leave it to you. And let's see how the time goes. If required, we'll just pick up some case studies on LRS. But that's not the focus of today's talk. Okay. See, very quickly, this is the whole regulatory framework whenever we look at outbound investment. There is this section 6, which talks about capital account transaction. There is the capital account transaction regulations under the FEMA law. You then have the FEMA notification 120, which is the core outbound investment regulation, which of course would be the key part of our today's discussions. You also have the master direction, which the Reserve Bank issues from time to time. And a couple of issues are always clarified by Reserve Bank via the FAQs. So FAQs also would form part of the applicable regulatory framework. You of course have the LRS scheme and the API-DIR circulars issued by RBI from time to time. And FEMA being more an administered law, master directions, FAQs, while they are strictly not part of the regulations, they form a very important part of any practitioner's practice, and it gives us a sense of what the regulator is really thinking and how it is interpreting these regulations. So we will heavily borrow from some of these allied laws. Very simply, if you look at the definition of capital account transaction, one part of the capital account transaction says that it is a transaction which alters the assets or liabilities outside India of persons resident in India. And hence, when an Indian party makes an investment outside India, there is an alteration of the asset of this Indian party outside India. And this transaction therefore is characterized as capital account transaction. Very, very interestingly, subsection 3 of section 6 used to provide that Reserve Bank inter alia would regulate inbound investment, outbound investment, etc. And this subsection has been deleted with effect from 15th October 2019. It was introduced in the Finance Act 2015. So the whole philosophy was that henceforth it is the central government which will lay down the regulations as regards inbound investment, as regards outbound investment. And Reserve Bank would be given power only to lay down regulations for debt instruments. Other than debt instruments, Reserve Bank may not have the power to issue any new regulations. For 4 years, that particular omission was not made effective. And it is now on 15th October 2019 that they have finally made that omission effective, which today means that Reserve Bank has no power to issue regulations on outbound investment. And maybe we'll very briefly touch upon it as to what does that mean. So today, if you look at the way section 6 has been worded, they have introduced subsection 2A. Subsection 2 talks about debt instruments, which of course is in the domain of Reserve Bank. Subsection 2A of section 6 talks about central government in consultation with Reserve Bank will specify any class or classes of capital account transactions not involving debt instruments which are permissible. So very technically, what is the impact of the omission of subsection 3 and the introduction of subsection 2A? That henceforth outbound regulations would be under the purview of central government. If you further go to section 47, it says that however, any regulations which has been issued by the Reserve Bank till date, that is something which will continue to be applicable. And hence the ODI regulations, basically notification 120, which was issued by Reserve Bank, unless the central government comes out with a fresh set of regulations, the way they did it in the case of inbound regulations, where the government came up with non-debt instrument regulations, the ODI regulations earlier issued by Reserve Bank will continue to remain valid. But this is a fundamental shift, which we have to understand, that any new amendment, any new regulations as regards outbound regulation is something which will have central government as the key nodal agency. If you really look at the routes for overseas investment, one is the most popular route, which is overseas direct investment by Indian party. We'll touch upon it as to what do you mean by Indian party, etc. This talks about investment in an overseas joint venture or a wholly owned subsidiary. Then you have overseas investment by individuals in India. This could be by a proprietorship concern under the RBI approval route, or this could be under the LRS regulations. I believe the last session touched upon the LRS regulation, so we will not touch much upon this route. And then third is other kinds of overseas investment. For example, acquisition of qualification shares. If I am a director in a particular country and the regulations of that country compel me to buy qualification shares before I could be a director, then I'm allowed to do that. Acquisition of rights shares. If I'm already a shareholder in a foreign company and there is a rights issue, I can participate. And the other category is receipt of shares under ESOP scheme. If I am receiving any shares under ESOP scheme, that is also something which forms part of the overseas investment regulation framework. So this is a broad category of different kinds of overseas direct investment. So the key category which we mentioned is the ODI by an Indian party. What is an Indian party? The way Indian party has been defined is a company, a LLP, a registered partnership firm, any body created under Act of Parliament. For example, a limited liability partnership is a new body which has been created by the Act of the Parliament. So even an LLP is covered, and any other entity notified by Reserve Bank in future, which means that a company obviously can make an overseas direct investment, but even an LLP can make, even a registered partnership firm can make, or any other body which has been created by the Act of a Parliament. So that is the definition of an Indian party. You also have resident individuals which are part of the eligible investors, which I earlier mentioned that they can invest under the proprietorship concern route, which requires a prior RBI approval, or they can invest under the LRS route. And then there are certain special cases which of course require again a prior RBI approval, especially a trust, a society, and unregistered partnership. In practice, such instances are far and few, where such unregistered entities would go to Reserve Bank for an approval. If you look at some of the key definition, and we have already touched upon the definition of an Indian party, but if you look at the definition of direct investment outside India, the definition says that a direct investment outside India means investment by way of contribution to the capital or subscription to the memorandum of association of a foreign entity. Here you have to focus on the term capital and the term foreign entity. There are times where one does not get any shares. For example, one has to invest in the common stock of a single company. It might still be regarded as an eligible direct investment outside India. There are cases, and maybe we'll take up some case study, where the foreign entity is not a foreign company, but the definition of direct investment outside India is wide enough to cover any kind of a foreign entity, such as a cooperative entity. If you, for example, invest in Netherlands, you typically tend to invest in a co-op, and it's the co-op which will then invest into a BV, which is a private company. If you go to Australia, you typically tend to invest in a business trust, and business trust then would invest into what you call a private company. So there are some variety of structures available globally, and most of these structures would fit into the definition of direct investment outside India. It also says that this investment could be by way of also purchase of existing shares. So it is not necessary that every time you will invest into the fresh capital, even an existing share of a foreign entity can be purchased, and such purchase could be by way of a market purchase or a contractual one-to-one private placement, or even through stock exchange. But under no circumstances, direct investment outside India includes a portfolio investment. And we'll take up some case studies as to what do you mean by portfolio investment. But if it's a strategic investment, yes, it comes under direct investment outside India. If it's a portfolio investment, it cannot be regarded as a direct investment outside India. These are two, categories. As I mentioned, it could be a joint venture where you participate along with other shareholder, or it could be a wholly owned subsidiary, where the entire capital is held by the Indian party per se. In practice, we always are asked questions. What is the percentage or the minimum percentage one should have in the joint venture? And if you look at the regulations, there is no such percentage which is specified. A 5%, a 10%, a 15% investment could also lead to a joint venture. The important point is that whatever percentage of investment we make, it should not be regarded as a portfolio investment. It should be regarded as a strategic investment. It should be regarded, something which you are jointly doing a business with a foreign party. And there are some indicative tests, like, do you have a shareholders agreement? Do you have a seat on the board of directors? Are there powers given to you to take business decisions? If some of these tests are satisfied, it doesn't matter what is your percentage into the foreign company. It would still be regarded as a joint venture investment. This is the point I was earlier mentioning, that the emphasis is on foreign entity, which is formed, registered, or incorporated. So it is very wide. It does not mean that it should only be a foreign company. In practice, it could be a limited liability partnership. In US, it could be a LLC, which is a limited liability company, which under certain state laws of US may not be regarded as a corporate body. It could be a business trust. In Europe, it could be something like a cooperative society, which people invest for tax reasons. So it's extremely wide. And in practice, we have never faced problem in investing into some of these innovative vehicles under the ODI regulations. Now, there are two routes available for direct investment outside India. One is the automatic route, one is the approval route. Under the automatic route, your total eligibility is 400% of the net worth of the Indian company. And typically, the term net worth is defined to mean paid up capital plus free reserves. So if the net worth of a company is, let's say, 5 lakhs, that company can invest up to 20 lakhs outside. If the net worth is 5 crore, that company can invest up to 20 crore. There is another set of investment under the automatic route, that is a ODI by an Indian party, which is engaged in financial services sector. This also will come under the automatic route, but there are certain more stringent conditions provided, and we'll touch upon it in one of the slides. And then there is a specific framework for ODI in the oil sector, where again the Reserve Bank has come up with a separate framework. So you will typically see these three kinds of investments happening under the automatic route. The first is the non-financial sector. Second is the financial sector. Third is the oil sector. The sectors which are prohibited is real estate business and banking. So you cannot invest in real estate business. And the way the real estate business has been defined, it says that real estate business means buying and selling of real estate or trading in TDRs, but does not include development of townships, construction of residential premises, roads, or bridges. So if you are, let's say, getting into a construction business outside India, that is something which may not be regarded as a real estate business, and hence it may be permitted. But if you are buying real estate property, selling it, that will squarely fall under the real estate business, and it may not be permitted. One burning issue which we face very regularly is that, let us say you are not buying and selling property, but you are into leasing of properties. So you will maybe buy a property and you will put it on lease. Is that something which is permitted? My personal view is it is permitted, but when you go to Reserve Bank, you are never getting a clear answer. We know of a couple of authorized dealers which are taking a view that yes, a leasing is something which should not be regarded as a real estate business and which is permitted. But this is something where we have written to Reserve Bank a couple of times and we have never received a clear response. It's very interesting to note that the definition of real estate business under the inbound regulation specifically excludes leasing. So if a foreign company were to invest in an Indian company and that Indian company is into leasing of commercial properties, then such investment is not regarded as a real estate business. This is a specific clarification, a specific exclusion made in the definition of real estate business for the purposes of inbound regulation. And logically, you will always have inbound regulations which are more stringent compared to an outbound regulation. So if the government is happy to get investment in an inbound regulation framework where it is permitting leasing, it but looks natural that if I am actually expanding outside India, I should be permitted to invest into an overseas leasing activity. But this is something which unfortunately is a matter of controversy, and therefore either we take a council opinion, we take a banker's authorized dealer's approval, or their clarification, and only then take it. Then the second category is the approval route. So whenever you do not meet any conditions of the automatic route, you will automatically fall under the approval route. Also, as I had earlier mentioned, ODI by trust, societies, proprietorship concerns, unregistered partnership firms, that is also something where you will need to go to Reserve Bank. So why don't we very quickly brush up some criterias of what are the conditions which you need to fulfill if you want to fall under the automatic route. The first condition is that your business should be engaged in a bona fide business. So you cannot form entities where you are not carrying out any business. So it's a very important condition. The second condition, as I mentioned to you, that you have a cap on the total investment, which is 400% of the net worth. The third condition is your valuation requirements have to comply with, and maybe I'll just very quickly go to the valuation slide. So this is the valuation framework. If your investment is exceeding $5 million, then you need a valuation report from the category 1 merchant banker, which is registered with SEBI, or a investment banker or merchant banker of the foreign country or of the host country. But if your investment is less than 5 million or 5 million or less than 5 million, then even a chartered accountant in India or a certified public accountant in the host country, that entity can issue a valuation report. But if your investment is by way of swap of shares, then compulsorily you have to get a valuation report from a merchant banker, which is registered with SEBI, or a merchant banker outside India. So this is the valuation framework. It is very important that all the transactions relating to a JV WOS is routed only through one branch of an AD bank. So you cannot, let's say send one tranche of money through a Delhi branch, another tranche of money through a Hyderabad branch. No, you have to designate one branch. In future, you may change that branch, after informing the AD. In practice, that is possible, but at no juncture can you keep on doing multiple transactions through multiple branches. Also, it is important that the Indian party should not be on the RBI's caution list or under investigation by any enforcement agency. Sometimes it happens that, the ED, the Enforcement Directorate, has initiated certain proceedings against that Indian company. Unfortunately, if such a proceeding is in progress, then the right of that Indian company to make an ODI under the automatic route goes away. Then it has to, for every tranche of investment, go back to Reserve Bank and get a specific approval. There is also a restriction that in whichever country you form your overseas joint venture, wholly owned subsidiary, step down subsidiary, It should not be a country which is identified as a non-cooperative country by the FATF. FATF is the Financial Action Task Force. It's a global body. Uh, Interestingly, if you go to the FAQs provide a further refinement, and FAQs are clarifying that the prohibition is applicable only for countries which are identified by FATF as call for action, and not for all countries which are identified as non-cooperative. And as of now, if you look at the list, you basically have North Korea and Iran in that list, which is, call for action, which is very interesting because, before this FAQ had come, we were taking a more wider interpretation of the number of countries which were covered under the non-cooperative list issued by the FATF. And this list keeps on changing. So at the time when you make an investment, you also always have to go to the FATF website, look at the prohibited country, take a print and keep it on record. So these are some of the key conditions if you want to come under the automatic route. Now let us talk a bit on the ceiling of investment. I did mention 400% of the net worth of Indian party. So the first interesting issue which arises is that, is share premium part of the net worth of the Indian company? And let us spend some time on this whole issue of share premium. If you look at the way
Vishalji, if I can just get 1 second, I'm
Yes,
sorry to disturb.
sure.
I can see many participants are raising their hands. I'll request you to raise any questions through the Google form only. We will be able to take the questions through Google Forms only. Thank you. Vishalji, please continue.
Sure. Thank you. So, one of the interesting issue which arises is that I have a share premium in the balance sheet, and can I consider that share premium to be part of the net worth? The way the net worth is defined under the FEMA regulation is to simply say paid up capital plus free reserves. A share premium is definitely not part of the paid up capital. So the question is the share premium part of the free reserves? And very interestingly, under the new Companies Act, share premium very strictly is not part of the free reserves, the way they have defined it. And therefore, there is a bit of a divergence under the definition of net worth under the old Companies Act and under the new Companies Act. So very strictly, we advise clients that if you have a share premium and you intend to use the share premium for the 400% of the limit, then you better convert the share premium into maybe bonus shares, further paid up capital, because very strictly share premium may not be part of the free reserves and hence may not be part of the net worth. In practice, when we speak with the bankers, they are pretty comfortable. They are saying, no problem, you have share premium, it is part of the net worth. So very, very practically, we have not faced much issue. While sometimes on a very protective basis, we advise clients that let's not take a chance, let's convert share premium into paid up capital. But the bankers apparently are not much concerned about this technicality, and they believe that no, it should be regarded as part of the net worth. The second part also is that when you look at certain reporting forms, the PLA, the ODI, there again, there are certain sections which apparently seem to indicate that share premium also will be regarded as part of the overall net worth. And of course, they have really copied the old forms which were there pre the new Companies Act, but those forms are still continuing, or those paras are still continuing. But this is one issue which, one has to take a conscious call whether it wants to take a view as to whether share premium will be part of the net worth and will be regarded as free reserves. The other interesting issue is that, somewhere in August 2013, some exact 7 years back, Reserve Bank had, via a APDIR circular, reduced the net worth limit to 100% temporarily, which was increased again after some 9 months back to 400%. But if today you read the notification, which is the bare regulation for outbound, it is not referring to 400%. It is simply saying total financial computation commitment not to exceed 100%. The only saving grace is they are saying, or as decided by RBI from time to time. So in spite of some infirmity, we are all taking a view that the term as decided by RBI from time to time in that residual clause, the 400% of the limit would be included. And of course, this is more of a drafting issue. How do you interpret it? But today, safely, we are presuming that yes, 400% limit should be available. It is also important to note that if your overall financial commitment exceeds $1 billion in a financial year, then you have to take RBI approval, irrespective of the fact that you are still within the limit of 400% of net worth. So let's say there is an Indian company, the net worth is the $800 billion, and which means it can safely invest, more than USD 1 billion in the ODI route. But moment it exceeds 1 billion, sorry, it has to go to Reserve Bank and take a prior approval. And this limit is per financial year. So if you were to really invest $500 million and in the second year $550 million, apparently you may be okay. So moment the investment exceeds $1 billion in a financial year, that suddenly comes under the RBI approval. But this overall ceiling of 400% does not apply if the investment is made out of balance held in EEFC account or out of the ADR GDR proceeds. There's a specific exclusion. So if you're able to carve out these investments so as to coming from a EEFC account or ADR GDR proceeds, you don't have to worry about the limits. You can invest as much as you want out of these balances. As regards investment which are under the approval route, the regulation says that the Reserve Bank will look at 4 factors before it allows. One is the prima facie viability of the joint venture or a wholly owned subsidiary outside India. And this is very interesting because whenever in the past we have made a request for allowing an ODI under the approval route, we have always given a viability report to Reserve Bank to persuade Reserve Bank that we believe that we will make profits and hopefully we will never be required to write off any of the investments. So this becomes a very important document, a very important justification before Reserve Bank. Second is Reserve Bank looks at factors such as contribution to external trade and other benefits which will accrue to India, such as the forex benefits. Third is the financial position and business track record of the Indian company. So if it's a new company not having great track record, it's very unlikely that you'll get an approval from RBI to invest overseas under the approval route. And of course, lastly, it's the expertise and experience of the Indian party in the same or related line of activity. So under the automatic route, there is no bar as to the operating sector one can invest. So let us say I am into steel and I can still, go and, create a trading company under, let's say electronics, doesn't matter that steel and electronics do not match. I am fitting under the automatic route. But moment I'm coming under the approval route, our experience has been that RBI is not very comfortable if an Indian company were to invest into a very unrelated sector outside India, even though if it's under the operating route. These are, of course, the various sources of funding: ADR, GDR, EEFC, swap of shares, market purchase, which is like forex, capitalization of export and other dues. So you have some recoverable from a foreign company, you can convert that into shares. So this is something which is always possible. FAQ interestingly says that an Indian company cannot acquire shares of a foreign entity without payment or on deferred payment basis. So while the regulations are silent, FAQ is very clear, which effectively means that even if the foreign company is issuing me shares or a foreign shareholder is selling me shares and is ready to receive the payment after, let's say, 1 year, 2 years, that is something which the Reserve Bank is not comfortable. So Reserve Bank is very clear that, sorry, if you have the funds, you make a overseas direct investment, else you will not be allowed to make it under any deferred payment arrangement. This is again a very interesting section, which is computation of net worth, which says that the benefit of the net worth of a holding company can be made available to the subsidiary company, and vice versa. The net worth of the subsidiary company can be made available to the holding company. for which, of course, there is a letter of disclaimer which has to be furnished by the holding or subsidiary company. What does it mean in practice? What it means is that if I, as a holding company, I have a net worth of, let's say, 100 rupee, but I want to make an investment of 500, which I cannot because my limit is only 4 times my net worth. And let us say, even the net worth of my subsidiary is 50 rupee. Then I can go to Reserve Bank and I can present a joint net worth of 100 and 50, which is 150. And then 4 times 150, I can make an outbound investment. And this is surprisingly, in my view, a double counting. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the balance sheet of holding company, and if the balance sheet of the holding company has a net worth of 100, that would always reflect the investment made into subsidiary, let's say to the tune of 50. Of course, the subsidiary may create its own reserves in future. But Reserve Bank is somehow, the formula is permitting this kind of a double counting. But it has been there since donkey's years. Nobody has raised any objection, and hence the Reserve Bank has not really modified this regulation. So the benefit can always be taken if there is a shortfall in the net worth, which either a holding company or a subsidiary company requires to make a ODI investment. This facility is not available vis-a-vis investment in a partnership firm. So you have to be a company if you want to take benefit of this holding subsidiary net worth. And as I discussed, the overall financial commitment which one can make for ODI is 4 times your current net worth. And this includes equity preference shares, debt, financial guarantees, bank guarantees, performance guarantees, guarantees given on behalf of step down subsidiary. So if I have, let's say, invested 100 rupee in the equity shares, it will be counted towards financial commitment. If I have given a loan of 50 rupee further to my overseas subsidiary, that 50 rupee again will be counted towards my financial commitment, and it will be consuming my limit of 400%. If I have given a financial guarantee on behalf of my overseas company, that financial guarantee again would be counted under the 400% net worth. If I've given a performance guarantee, let's say of 50 rupee, then only 50% of that, which is 25 rupees, would be counted, as consuming my limit of the 400% net worth. So you will therefore have to look at the overall financial commitment and not just the rupee or the dollar invested into equity or preference shares. This is very important. Why don't we pause here if you are okay, and maybe I'll continue on some other this thing. But if there are any questions, why don't we take some questions at this stage?
I think it's a great idea, and also we have already received 15 questions.
Okay.
So we can do one thing. I think we can take 3 or 4 questions right now.
Sure, no problem. Yes.
Okay. So first question is from Mr. Nitish, right? Nitish's question is on valuation from merchant banker. So what he wants to ask is valuation report from merchant banker necessary if a private limited company invests an additional share capital in its already created wholly owned subsidiary, and that investment is going to be at a par value?
Answer is yes. Even though you are investing in your own wholly owned subsidiary, you still have to take the valuation report. If the investment has exceeded $5 million of a merchant banker, if the investment is below $5 million, then even of a chartered accountant. But this requirement is also applicable even if you are investing in your wholly owned subsidiary.
So second question is from Mr. Lakshmi Narayan. An Indian company which is a private limited company, whether it can invest into an overseas company under portfolio investment scheme under automatic route, and if so, what is the limit?
If it's a private company, it cannot invest in any portfolio investment. There are some leeways available for an Indian listed company to invest in portfolio investments. I'll touch upon that in one of the slides. But clearly, if it's a private company, there is no way RBI would even give an approval to invest in portfolio investment. So you will then have to fall back on the LRS route for direct portfolio investments.
Okay. Next question is regarding partly paid up shares. So can an Indian company using ODI route make investment in a partly paid up shares
That's
under automatic route?
yes, that seems to be possible. So this FAQ which I had mentioned about FAQ 63, which said that an Indian party cannot acquire shares of a foreign company without payment on a deferred payment basis. So we had an occasion to discuss with the banker, and the view we came back was that if under the laws of that foreign company, partly paid shares are allowed, then an arrangement of a partly paid share cannot be regarded as a deferred payment arrangement. And as and when the calls are made by that foreign company, I will go and invest into that. So it seems to be possible to invest in a partly paid capital structure of a foreign company, subject, of course, to the compliance of the foreign laws. So quite possible.
Sir, the next question is from Mr. Aditya. Is investment in REITs outside India permitted, as REITs underlying income will mainly be from leasing activities? Also, what could be the logic or reasoning behind restriction on trading in real estate sector under FEMA?
See, the first question, which is investment in REIT, this is normally regarded as a portfolio investment.
Okay.
So unless you are floating a REIT and you can under the financial services sector, and you can say that this is actually a business carried on by me, I have not seen any investment being permitted under the REIT because it's typically regarded as portfolio investment. So that would be difficult. The second point about not permitting in real estate, which is trading of properties. See, this is a risk management policy by Reserve Bank, where Reserve Bank in its wisdom believes that certain sectors I don't want to open up, for the Indian parties, because that might, lead to a lot of riskier investments outside India and might create a lot of speculative activities. So that's a call which Reserve Bank has always been wary of, real estate related activities. It's always regarded as a sensitive sector. So it's part of the risk management policy of Reserve Bank. Why it has not been allowing it.
Okay. So next question is on the differentiation or identification of any investment under portfolio scheme or ODI scheme. So there is a lot of confusion as to how to identify which is a portfolio investment or which is an ODI investment. So how
it's a very interesting question, keeps on coming very regularly. In fact, on a lighter note, most of the time, the client knows it's a portfolio investment, but it comes and says that, can you please help me structure it as a strategic investment, because portfolio investments are not permitted under the ODI route. See, the simple thumb rule is that, are you doing business as a businessman, or you have come in as a financial investor where you have no role, no influence over the company in which you are investing? If you're a pure financial investor, you have no role, no influence over the company in which you have invested, then such investment typically will be a portfolio investment. But let us say you are getting a board seat, you are part of the board of directors which will take business decisions. You have signed a shareholders agreement with the majority shareholder, where for certain decisions you will be consulted. Then these actions prove that you will be involved, though in the status of a minority shareholder. Then such investments would tend to be business strategic investments rather than portfolio investment. So normally a portfolio investment is one where you have no role in the business of the foreign company. So it's a very fact driven exercise, but these are some of the thumb rules which can be applied.
I think if we can take up last question for this break.
Right.
This question is from Mr. Prakash Sinha. His question is basically on write-off as far as ODI is concerned. Sometimes we invest in some subsidiary, that subsidiary suffers loss, right? And then a need arise where I have to write off that ODI or that investment. So what is the process, and what are the limits or what are the challenges here?
Right. Hi Prakash ji, good to hear you. what I'll do, there is one slide I have put on this write-off. So let me deal with
Great.
the write-off issue when I come to that slide. And if there are any questions, happy to take it up.
So we can proceed ahead, then we will take up
Okay.
rest of the questions.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Now let us talk about this bona fide business activity. So it's very interesting that the business activity could be in any operating sector, but the regulation says that it should be a bona fide business activity. And what does that mean? In one round tripping case, Reserve Bank has taken a view that if you have formed a company overseas and that company has only invested back into an Indian company, then that overseas entity is not into a bona fide business activity. There is a compounding order which is in public domain. So typically we have seen that moment you set up an SPV, and that SPV may be a pure holding company, but that SPV is then investing into an overseas operating activity, you will tend to satisfy the test of bona fide business activity. But if it's investing back into an Indian company and therefore you don't have an overseas bona fide business operations, then typically this clause is regarded as not being satisfied. That's the way how RBI has been interpreting. So most of the times it is a round tripping structure where we find some challenge in satisfying this clause. The other clauses I've already discussed, which is like real estate banking is prohibited outside India under the ODI sector. Now, if one wishes to invest in a financial services sector under the automatic route, then in addition to the conditions which I already mentioned, 400% limit, FATF condition, not in the caution list or being investigated by the enforcement directorate. So all those conditions would apply. And in addition to that, you have to fulfill 4 more conditions. So the first condition is that the current Indian entity should also be registered in India with the appropriate authority, which is basically Reserve Bank, for conducting financial services activities. So you ideally have to be some financial service player in India, typically, for example, NBFC, which is the most popular entity. So if you're not registered as a financial service player in India with RBI or SEBI, you cannot make investment outside India under the financial services sector. So the logic is that Reserve Bank only wishes that financial services player in India go and register abroad under the financial services sector business. The second condition is that this financial services player in India should have earned a net profit during the preceding 3 years. So again, they are not allowing any new NBFC or a loss-making NBFC to make any outbound investment. The third investment is very interesting. It says that it should have taken approval for undertaking such activities, which is the investment activity overseas, from the regulatory authority both in India and abroad before venturing into such financial activity. So let us say an NBFC wishes to form a wholly owned subsidiary, let's say in Singapore. And the Singapore company will then make investments in variety of private equity and other portfolio investments. And let's presume this NBFC in India is satisfying the net profit criteria for 3 years. And obviously NBFC is registered with Reserve Bank. So the first step is that it needs to go and take an approval from Reserve Bank for under the NBFC regulations for making an overseas investment. The good thing is that there is already a circular under the NBFC regulations where such entities are allowed to make overseas investments. So you don't have to go and get a specific approval under the NBFC laws. The challenge happens that many countries do not have the requirement of registering with the foreign financial regulator. For example, if the NBFC were to form a subsidiary in Singapore, the Singapore MFA, which is the Monetary Financial Authority, does not require you to register because you are not playing with public money. This is your own money. And therefore, technically, the condition of getting an approval from the regulatory authority in Singapore is not satisfied. In this case, you have to go to Reserve Bank and ask for a specific dispensation explaining that in Singapore, there is no way they will ever require me to register. And therefore, please relax this condition. And in cases I've seen Reserve Bank relaxing that condition. But this is important effectively because as per the auto route, you better be regulated by a financial regulator in India also and overseas also. The last condition is that you obviously should have fulfilled the prudential norms relating to capital adequacy as prescribed under the NBFC or other regulations. So these are the 4 conditions in addition to the other conditions if you want to make a ODI in the financial services sector abroad. One very interesting thing is that typically a CCPS is treated at par with equity. So whether you contribute a equity capital or you contribute a CCPS, they both are permitted and they both are treated at par. And if you have, let's say, given a loan to your joint venture or wholly owned subsidiary, you can convert that into equity or CCPS, under the automatic route. You don't really have to go and take any prior approval for this. Now, let us talk a bit about this guarantee, which the Indian party sometimes needs to give, to the joint venture or the wholly owned subsidiary. So what the regulation says is that if the Indian party has made an investment in the capital of the joint venture or wholly owned subsidiary, it can also give a guarantee, on behalf of that. So let us say that foreign entity is taking a loan from Bank of Singapore. The Bank of Singapore is not comfortable giving a loan because the balance sheet of the foreign entity is not very strong. So it says that why don't you get the guarantee from the Indian company? Because I, as a bank, I'm comfortable with the balance sheet strength of that Indian company. In that case, only and only if the Indian company has invested into the capital of that foreign company, can it really be eligible to give a guarantee, and which is then regarded as a financial commitment under the ODI route. Many times what happens, we have seen that there are foreign collaborators and sometimes they request the Indian collaborator that why don't you support me financially, I need this financial guarantee. And not necessarily would the Indian company have any investment in the shares of the foreign company. In that case, before you give any such guarantee, you have to invest in the equity capital. The interesting point is that how much do I need to invest? Can I invest 1%, 2%? Technically, you can invest 1% and still give a financial guarantee of, let's say, 100 crore if your net worth is sufficient. But a more balanced approach would be that it has to be a serious investment of capital. So normally bankers we have seen are more comfortable if you invest up to 5 to 10% in the equity capital of the foreign company and then give a large financial guarantee. While there have been some bankers which have said, no problem, you have invested in some small nominal shares, you qualify for this kind of a guarantee. But a more safer approach seems to be that your equity stake better be 5 or 10%, which is more a practical measure than anything. The second thing it says is that you can also give a guarantee on behalf of your first generation step down operating company. And there is a diagram which I'll take you through to make it more clear. And if you are giving any guarantee to the second level step down operating subsidiary, then you have to be under the approval rules, So let's look at this diagram. This will make it more clear. Look at the first scenario. Indian party is directly investing into the joint venture wholly owned subsidiary. Can it give a guarantee? Answer is yes. Does it require any prior approval? Answer is no. This is under the automatic route. And of course, that guarantee would be counted towards the financial commitment of 400% of net worth. Let's look at the second case. Indian party investing into a joint venture or an SPV. So it could be an operating company or it could be what you call an SPV. And then you have the first level step down operating company under it. Can the Indian party give a guarantee for the first level step down operating company under the operating automatic route? Answer is yes. The condition is that this first level step down operating company should not be an SPV, it should be into operations. Let's look at the third scenario. Indian party, there is one operating company. Under the operating company, there is an SPV. So it's a first level step down subsidiary, but that subsidiary is not into operations. It is actually a holding company, which has then invested into a second level step down subsidiary, which is an operating company. Can I give a guarantee for the first level step down subsidiary? Answer is no. Why? Because the first level step down subsidiary is not an operating company. It is an SPV. So I cannot give it under the automatic route. And now let's look at the last scenario, the fourth scenario. Indian party, an SPV under it. There is a first level step down operating company. There is a second level step down operating company. Can the Indian party give a guarantee to the first level step down operating company? Absolutely yes, automatic route. Can it give the guarantee to the second level step down operating company? Under the automatic route, no. Whether it can give under the approval route, answer is yes, provided directly, indirectly, it is holding 51% in that second level step down operating company. So these four scenarios will, hopefully make it clear when you can give a guarantee, when you cannot give, when you can give under the automatic route, when you have to approach to Reserve Bank under approval route. The song was good, so I did interrupt it. Sorry, let me go to the next slide. Now let's talk about pledge of shares of the joint venture or the wholly owned subsidiary. So can the Indian party create a pledge on the overseas company's shares, in favor of, let's say, any bank in India or an overseas lender? Answer is yes. But it can do only to avail a fund-based or a non-fund-based facility for either itself or its overseas company or any other overseas company. And it is important that whatever loan facility is obtained from the pledge of the shares of the overseas company, they are invested only for the core business activities overseas, but not for investing back in India in any manner. This is very important. You ultimately have to invest those funds back for your core business activities overseas, and under no circumstances should it be invested back in India. So that's the condition for pledge of shares of overseas company. Now let us look at charge on domestic assets. It is possible to create a charge on any domestic assets of the Indian party. And when we say domestic assets, it could be shares in other companies, it could be land, plant and machinery, whatever it is, but domestic assets, not foreign assets. And you can create a charge on such domestic assets in favor of an overseas lender for again securing either a fund-based or a non-fund-based facility to be used by your overseas company. So that's the first condition. The second condition is that whatever such fund-based facility you have created, it will be reckoned under your 400% net worth limit of financial commitment. So if you have already consumed your 400% limit to make overseas investment, then such an additional charge in favor of the overseas lender for funding your overseas subsidiary is not possible. The third condition is again the same, that it has to be utilized for your core business activities overseas, and it cannot be invested back in India in any manner. And of course, the statutory auditor will certify in that regard. The next condition is that these domestic assets on which charge has been created should not be securitized. It cannot be securitized. And again, one interesting condition is that in case there is a default and the overseas lender, which has the charge on these domestic assets, then has to take possession of the domestic assets and sell it, it can sell these assets only to a resident. So if I am, let us say, Bank of Scotland, I have a charge on your land in India. You have defaulted on your loan. I have taken possession of your land. I cannot sell that land to a foreign investor. I have to sell it only to somebody who's a resident in India. So these are some of the conditions on which one can create charge on the domestic assets. Now, what about charge on the foreign assets? So let us say the foreign company may have certain plant and machinery, certain land and certain other assets. Again, under the automatic route, you can create a charge on the overseas assets in favor of the domestic lender, again to secure any fund or non-fund based facility, and that facility can be availed either by the Indian party or any of its group companies in India or any of its foreign subsidiaries, doesn't matter whichever level it is. Again, this fund-based, non-fund-based facility will be counted towards your 400% limit. And again, these overseas assets would not be required or would not be allowed to be securitized. And it is important that again it is utilized only for your core business activities and not for any other activity. So these are some of the conditions which will allow you to create a charge on foreign assets. So if you look at it, you can create a pledge on the shares of your overseas company subject to certain conditions. You can create a charge on the domestic assets subject to conditions. You can create charge on the foreign assets of your foreign company subject to conditions. So it's a pretty flexible, financial framework provided by Reserve Bank on this. Now, this was one question which somebody had asked, that can an Indian private company make a portfolio investment? Answer is no. It is only an Indian listed company which is allowed to make portfolio investment, and portfolio investment is defined. So an Indian listed company can invest in the shares of an overseas listed company or in the bonds or fixed income securities issued by such overseas listed company, subject to the overall limit of 50% of its net worth as on the last audited balance sheet. So this is the only exception which is given for a portfolio investment by an Indian listed company into another overseas listed company under the ODI regulations. Other than that, there are no portfolio investments which are permitted under the auto route. These are some typical compliances. You have to pass a board resolution for overseas investment. You have to get a valuation certificate. You have to, once you send the funds abroad, you have to file a form ODI within 30 days. Typically, Reserve Bank will allot a unique identification number for such foreign investment. So you have to chase your banker to get the UIN, because if you do not get that UIN, you cannot make the second investment. You have to file proof of getting the share certificates with your authorized dealer within 6 months. And of course, lastly, any further tranche can be made subject to all other conditions, valuation report, but provided the UIN has been received from Reserve Bank. So these are some basic compliances. These are some, other reporting requirements. So there is a requirement of filing an annual performance report by December 31st. Ideally, it should be on the basis of audited accounts, but if for any reason your foreign subsidiary is not subject to local audit, then you can even do it on the basis of unaudited accounts, where of course your statutory auditor have to satisfy that the laws of the foreign company does not mandatorily require an audit, etc. Any investment changes, any sale, any additional investment, you have to report it within 30 days, to your authorized dealer, etc. And every year you have to file an additional FLA, foreign liabilities and asset, written on or before 15 July of every year. These are some basic routine, what you call compliances, which you have to really carry out. Let's talk a bit of divestment. There are different modes of divestment. If you look at the regulations, they speak about a sale, a gift, and accounting write-off. And we'll touch upon that accounting write-off query of Prakashji. FAQs refer to two more modes of divestment, which is basically liquidation and merger. So even a liquidation and merger practically has been accepted as an accepted mode of divestment. And there are frequently a buyback of the shares of the foreign company, a capital reduction which happens. And frequently there are queries which we receive as to whether these are permitted, because they do not find these words anywhere in the regulations. Answer is yes. While these are not specifically expressed, it will come under the broader meaning of divestment or transfer of shares. And the authorized dealers are also quite comfortable. So you can do a buyback or a capital reduction even under the automatic route. You don't really need to go and get any specific approval. So there is a wide array uh, uh, in which you can really divest your you know overseas investments. Uh, Now, assuming you are transferring your shares to either an Indian party or to a non-resident, and there is no write-off of investments, right? Which means you are not suffering a loss. Then the question is, can you do that under the automatic route? Can you sell it under the automatic route? Answer is yes. There are some conditions. The first condition is that if you are selling shares of a listed company overseas, then the sale has to be effected through a stock exchange. If the sale is not effected through a stock exchange, you have to come and get a prior approval. If you are selling the shares of an unlisted company by a private arrangement, then you have to sell it at the fair value, uh, for which of course you will get a valuation report from a CA, CPA, etc. One of the condition is that the shares of the foreign company which you are selling should not have any payable to the Indian company, like dividend, technical know-hows, some export proceeds. So many times the Indian company might have exported some goods to the foreign company. Those transactions are still outstanding. The foreign party still has to make payment to the Indian company. And unless those accounts are settled, the Indian company cannot sell the shares of the foreign company under the automatic route. Also, one more condition is that you can sell only after 1 year of existence of the foreign company. So let us say in the month of August 2020, I have formed a foreign company, and in the month of September, I want to sell it. Sorry, I cannot sell it under the automatic route. I have to go and approach Reserve Bank, and because I have not completed 12 months. So you have to be in operation for at least 1 full year, and the APR should have been submitted to Reserve Bank. That is a must before you can really sell your shares in the foreign company. And again, the same condition which was there vis-a-vis ODI, that the Indian company should not be under an investigation by CBI or any other regulatory authority in India. Because if it's under an investigation, then again, any such sale will require a prior approval of the Reserve Bank person. And once you sell, you have to report that sale within 30 days, and the sale proceeds have to be repatriated back into India within 90 days. So this is the broad framework where you are selling, but where you are not making a loss on the investments. Let us look at a scenario where you are making a loss. So you are selling and there is a loss. So in the following cases, it is permitted under the automatic route to book a loss, to suffer a loss on the divestment. The first option available is where your overseas company, your joint venture, your wholly owned subsidiary was listed on the overseas stock exchange. So if it was a listed company, you can sell it and you can suffer a loss. The second auto window available is where the Indian company is listed and its net worth is 100 crore or more. So if the Indian company is a large listed Indian company, and the way they have defined it is a net worth of 100 crore or more, then if it suffers a loss on sale, no problem. Reserve Bank doesn't bother, it doesn't care. So that's the second window available. The third window available is where the Indian company is not a listed company, but the investment which it had made in that overseas venture did not exceed USD 10 million. In that case, again, it need not go to Reserve Bank for any prior approval for any loss on sale of shares. So that's the third window available. And the fourth window is that if it's a small listed company, which means if it's a listed company, but the net worth is less than 100 crore, in that case, again, it can sell the shares at a loss, provided that the total investment did not exceed 10 million. So an unlisted company and a listed company with a net worth of less than 100 crore, they are kept at par. So as to permit an auto write-off of the investment on sale of shares. Of course, all other conditions which we discussed in the earlier slide, fair value, 1 year of operations, not under investigation, etc., everything will be applicable here. There is a RBI FAQ which says that conversion of equity into loan or debenture or preference capital, which is not a CCPS, would require a prior RBI approval. So if I am holding equity shares and I'm converting that equity shares into a loan or a debenture, that is something which will be regarded as a transfer of sale of shares, and it will require a prior RBI approval. This is interesting. See, this is a restructuring of balance sheet. So in this case, you have not actually sold your shares, but you are writing off the value of your shares. So you might have invested, let's say 10 crore, and you believe that 10 crores have become 5 crores. So you want to write off the 5 crore. You are basically creating an impairment loss in your books. Even in such case where you are doing a restructuring of the balance sheet, the Reserve Bank says, sorry, you have to come to me if you are not satisfying certain mathematical criteria. And the important point is that if you are merely making a provision for impairment and keeping the principal value same, then you don't have to approach Reserve Bank. So let me give an example. Let us say you have made an investment of 10 crore and you have made a provision of 5 crore in the books towards impairment loss. So you have not written off the investment, but you have made a mere provision. In that case, Reserve Bank says, no problem. You don't have to come to me because you have not written off that amount, but you have not made a provision, but you have actually written down that 10 crore to 5 crore. That would be regarded as a restructuring of balance sheet. And in that case, if it's a listed Indian company, then up to 25% of the equity investment would be allowed to be written off. If it's an unlisted company, then again up to 25% would be allowed. See, this is very interesting because many times what happens, auditors would say, sorry, you have invested 10 crores, 50% has been impaired. Please write it off. Please charge it to P&L, no provision, nothing. You technically cannot do it because Reserve Bank approval has not come. And therefore, typically an auditor will qualify or, make it a, EOM in the audit report saying that, for so and so reason, they have not really carried out an impairment loss. So many times you will see accounting standards conflicting with this, requirement, to go to RBI. If your overall write-off, not a sale, not a loss, but merely write-off in the books due to impairment is exceeding 25% of the total equity investment. So why don't we pause here once again, and if there are any questions, happy to take it up.
So I think write-off you have already discussed. So can we take up last question of Mr. Prakash Sinha?
Yes. Yes. So Prakash, your question was on this write-off, right? And effectively, if you are not selling your shares, but you are merely writing it off in your books of accounts, and this write-off is an actual write-off and not just creating a provision for the impairment loss, then the limit up to which you can write it off without an RBI approval is effectively 25%. Moment you are exceeding that, then you have to go to Reserve Bank, or if you're an unlisted company and you still have to go to Reserve Bank, even if you're writing it off up to 25%. That auto route is only available for the listed companies. Does it address your query?
And what if instead of actually writing off, we create a provision for write-off?
So interestingly, if you are merely creating a provision, then you don't have to go to Reserve Bank. There was a confusion, but we have taken some counsel opinions, spoken with some authorized dealer, and they said that if you're creating a provision, and the principal amount is left intact in your ledger account of the investment, then this requirement to go to RBI doesn't apply to you.
I think it should answer his question. Raviji, are you there?
Yes,
Okay,
I am here. I'll take the
okay,
next one.
sure.
So there is a question from Divya Agarwal. If a person invests under LRS to buy 100% equity of foreign LLC abroad and it's worth say $7,500, but is acquiring 100% shares at $5,000. The worth is 7,500, but they're acquiring at $5,000. Whether any valuation report is required, and also what other compliance would be required. Also, if said individual enters into agreement in capacity as partner in Indian LLP with that particular LLC abroad, then as related party, what reporting is required under FIMAM?
Can you repeat the second leg of the question? First leg is pretty clear that we are acquiring shares at less than market value in an LLC under the LRS. What was the second question?
If said individual enters into an agreement in capacity as partner in Indian LLP with that particular LLC abroad, this is, I am presuming, after the investment has been made abroad. So then as related party, what would be the requirement of reporting under FIMAM?
Okay, let me take the first question. The first question is that I am making an investment under LRS in a company, in an LLC. Any investment in a foreign entity under LRS needs to be jointly done under the ODI regulations. The first condition is that you have to satisfy or do it within your $250,000 limit, which in your case you are, because you're only spending $5,000. So the limits are satisfied. The second point was that you're actually investing at less than market value. The market value is higher and you are maybe getting a good deal. This is again, which is absolutely fine. Reserve Bank has no problem whatsoever. The third issue is that do I need to really, go and take, a Reserve Bank, a valuation report? And typically, we have seen that whenever you are making an investment under the ODI route read with LRS, there is a valuation report which is being insisted to by the authorized dealer. So you will get a valuation report. The valuation report may say 7,500, doesn't matter, but you are investing 5,000, so the banker should not have any other problem. And of course, it's important that when you sell that, you should not sell it at a loss, because no write-off is allowed for any investment in an overseas company under the ODI stroke LRS route. Any such write-off is something which you will need to take a prior approval before selling it. So that's the broad framework for investment. The second leg of the question was that the Indian LLP, which is owned by this concerned Indian investor, Indian individual, and the US LLC, they enter into some kind of a partnership. Now, the question is what kind of a partnership? If the LLP is investing into the US LLC, then that would be regarded as the second ODI investment by the Indian LLP, for which you will make appropriate reporting and all that. But if there is any business arrangement between the Indian LLP and the US LLC, then that business arrangement, that transaction could be a current account transaction, which may be allowed under the current account transaction rules, for which you will typically follow the normal AD bank route, A2 form and all that, and you don't have to make any specific filings for that. So the relationship between the Indian LLP and the US LLC will determine the kind of reporting, whether you are falling under ODI, and if there is no such investment, and if it's a simple business transaction, which typically is a current account transaction, then you will, via the authorized dealer, file a relevant forms A2, etc., and make those. There are no separate reporting requirements.
I think this has answered her question.
Deepak ji will take the next one.
आप लीजिए, let me search other questions.
Okay. Sir, the next question is, can corporate guarantee be given under ODI where investment in capital does not give the Indian party controlling stake in the entity?
Yes, that is possible. It is not necessary that you should be controlling that foreign company. Even if that foreign company has a majority foreign shareholder and you are a minority shareholder, you as a minority shareholder can still give a corporate guarantee. But of course, this guarantee would be subsumed under your overall 400% net worth limit.
Okay.
So next
Uh,
question, yeah, please.
लीजिए दीपक जी.
Yeah, next question is from Mr. Subhash Khanna. It is regarding an individual, right? An individual gets permanent residency in Australia. Then that individual goes to Australia and then purchase a residential house in Australia using partly funds from India and partly funds outside India, right? And the partly funds which have been used outside India is from a Singapore company in which he is holding a 25% share. And so, what should be the situation here? What are the regulations, or what are the? I hope you have understood the question. Should I repeat it?
Yes, no, the question is clear. So the first step is effectively this is a individual who's migrating to Australia. So he's becoming a non-resident. That is the first important, impact. Moment he becomes a non-resident, the LRS route is not available. But the $1 million NRI route is available. So he can always use his NRI route to withdraw funds and make the payment to buy a house there. He is then accessing the funds from a foreign company, which coincidentally is a company which he had invested under the ODI LRS route. Now, very technically, there are no regulations which prohibit the Singapore company from lending that amount to the individual who has now become a non-resident and wishes to buy a house. The only two suggestions I would make is that preferably if the loan is given out of the reserves rather than the capital which was invested into ODI, that is a better scenario. And second, also the terms ideally should be at arm's length. So if the rate of interest in Singapore is typically 2.5-3%, that is the rate which should be charged to that individual. So nobody alleges that this is a stripping of funds of ODI for the benefit of an individual who has become a non-resident. Subject to this looks to be quite workable.
Next question is from Mr. Vinayak. He wants to ask, in case an approval is required for an ODI investment, when should this approval be applied for? Whether it should be applied when they are remitting funds to a consultant who is helping in incorporating the JV or WOS, or once the JV or WOS is formed and their bank account is there and they are remitting the paid up capital for that.
That's an interesting question because if you are making any payment to a consultant towards professional expenses, that typically is a current account transaction. It does not require a prior approval. So if you want to make the payment to the overseas consultant for helping or creating the necessary setup, you are free to do that. In practice, I'm sure you will first get an approval from Reserve Bank, get that surety that yes, I will now be allowed to form a company, and then you'll hire a consultant and make the payment to that consultant. So both are possible, but in practice, you will first go and take a RBI approval. And in any case, before RBI approval, under no circumstances would any capital be infused, into the foreign company.
Okay, sir.
So, Vishal, how much time is left as far as your presentation is concerned? Accordingly, we will take up more questions.
Yeah, so what I'll do, I will, overall there are some 70 slides, but I will skip the LRS slides, right? I'm presuming that was dealt with
that has already been
yesterday.
Yes.
So many of the slides will go away. So why don't I then, complete these slides. We are already at 6:30. Maybe in the next
Right,
10-15 minutes, I'll complete the balance slides,
right,
and
right.
then the balance 15 minutes will take up any balance questions.
Cool.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm just skipping these LRS related slides. This is the reporting thing I've already discussed. Let me spend some time on round tripping. This has always been a burning issue. Uh, you typically have this structure where there is a company A. Company A wishes to form a company overseas, which is company B1, and company B1 will then invest back into company C. I know in the past, many years back, such structures have been formed, taking a legal opinion that there is nothing under the FEMA regulations which prohibits this kind of an investment. In the last few years, ever since RBI started this practice of making the compounding orders public, and everybody got an opportunity to read the compounding orders, they realized that RBI is taking a very consistent view that in the current structure, company B cannot invest in company C without a prior RBI approval. Whether that investment is majority, minority, whether there is a bona fide purpose, sorry, you have been allowed to invest under the ODI route in company B for an overseas business. You cannot use those funds to create or have any Indian entity which is doing Indian business in any manner. And therefore, this is pretty clear that while today there are no regulations which prohibit this structure, you will go to Reserve Bank for this round trip structure. You will give Reserve Bank the logic as to why you are doing it, what are the commercial advantages, and we have seen couple of approvals being given by Reserve Bank where they were convinced that there was a commercial advantage of creating a round trip structure. Interestingly, there is an FAQ on ODI issued by Reserve Bank, which says that an Indian party would not be permitted to set up an Indian subsidiary through its foreign was or a JV. This is for the first time, though in the form of an FAQ, there is some prohibition of this kind of a round tripping structure. So today I think the practice is any kind of a round tripping structure, whether it is valid, has commercial rational, etc. You please go to Reserve Bank and do not take a unilateral stand of creating this. There is again this whole question of overseas branch, and questions come up whether an overseas branch gets covered under the ODI regulations. Does it require a prior RBI approval, etc.? And the answer is that technically an overseas branch is regarded as a resident entity under the definition of section 2 clause 5 of FEMA, and therefore there is no specific approval required to create a foreign branch. You can just go ahead, you can go and create a foreign branch. The restrictions are more about how much money you can send in your foreign currency account, because if you create a foreign branch, you will need a foreign currency account. And therefore, if you look at the foreign currency account regulations, they basically put certain quantitative limits that this is the maximum which will be infused into the foreign currency bank account. And effectively it says that higher of 15% of average annual sales during 2 years or 25% of net worth, whichever is higher, and 10% of average sales where remittance is made to incur recurring expenditure per se. So there are these quantitative limits to put money into the foreign currency account, which can then be utilized by the foreign branches. And the regulations also say that you have to close the foreign currency account if your branch is not set up within 6 months, or you have yourself closed the overseas branch, or you do not have a representative stationed at the branch for a period of 6 months. And therefore, while a foreign branch technically doesn't come under the ODI regulations, the important point to know is that there is no approval required, and the only restriction is really putting in money into a foreign currency account. Again, the limits do not apply if you have used your EEFC account, for such foreign branch, etc. Very quickly on the Indian ESOP scheme basically, it effectively permits a person resident in India to kind of subscribe to the shares of the foreign group if those shares are under the ESOP scheme. There are some simple conditions. One is that the shares under ESOP scheme are being offered by issuing under a global scheme, a uniform scheme. So it's not that for that specific employee that scheme has been formed. It should be applicable to all the employees, globally. You of course have to, file certain annual returns and all that. And if you sell the shares tomorrow, then you have to bring back that money in 90 days. So a typical simple condition as to how would you invest in that ESOP scheme, etc. These are some conditions which you have to follow if you are an unregistered partnership firm, or you are a trust and you want to get an approval from Reserve Bank. As I mentioned, these are far and few, but there are some specific criteria given under the regulations. I'll very quickly skip that. It's not very common. If you are an Indian AIF, and let us say you're a SEBI registered AIF, you want to invest overseas, it is possible to invest. Typically, you don't have to go to Reserve Bank for an approval, but you have to go to SEBI for an approval. And SEBI typically gives approval if there is some kind of an Indian connection. It's a very loosely worded definition under the SEBI regulation. But what SEBI sees is that if you have invested into some US company, the Indian AIF, then that US company better have some presence, some business in India. Then they consider it to be an Indian connection which satisfies, the SEBI regulations. The second is that the total funds which the AIF can utilize to invest abroad cannot be more than 25% of their investable funds. And third is there is an overall country cap of 750 million per year. So SEBI regulates that, and moment there is a cap of 750, let us say in the month of December it exceeds, then typically for the next 3 months you will unlikely get any approval from SEBI because your yearly limits have been consumed. So SEBI also has been ensuring that not more than $750 million are invested by all AIFs, VCFs taken together under the overseas companies, etc. Then I had mentioned earlier that under the NBFC regulations, not under FEMA, but under the NBFC regulations, the Reserve Bank has given auto approval for NBFCs to invest overseas. There are some interesting conditions. I'll just pick up one or two which are relevant. One, of course, is that an NBFC cannot invest in operating companies or in non-financial services sectors. It has to be in financial service sectors. So tomorrow, if NBFC wants to invest in a technology company, the circular doesn't permit. The Reserve Bank circular under the NBFC regulations would not permit. So it's a very clear policy framework issued where they are saying that an operating company in India can invest only in operating sectors, and a financial service player can invest only in the financial sector. So they have made a clear bifurcation between these two sectors. The other interesting point is that while the FEMA regulation permits 400% of the net assets, NBFC regulation says that the investment should not exceed 100% of the net owned funds. So, of course, and the way a net owned funds is calculated is very different compared to a net asset. A net owned fund typically will be a higher number compared to the net worth of an NBFC, but the limit is 100%, and which means that if you're an NBFC, you not only have to satisfy the 400% limit of a net asset, but you also have to satisfy under the local NBFC regulations 100% of the net owned funds. You cannot exceed that percent. So these are some of the key conditions which an NBFC under the local laws has to satisfy for making an investment abroad. There are some case studies. I'll quickly go through it if I have not touched upon it. The securities premium part I already dealt with. As I had explained earlier, very technically under the New Companies Act, securities premium are not considered as free reserves. As a corollary, it might not be counted towards the 400% limit under FEMA. The practical scenario seems to be that nobody is bothered and nobody is getting into all such nitty-gritty, and authorized bankers are pretty comfortable if the auditors are satisfied with this. Uh, the second issue, this is interesting. This is an interplay between FEMA and Companies Act. And under the Companies Act, today you have a regulation which basically says that you cannot have more than 2 layers of subsidiaries. So it's called the company's restriction of number of layers rules. It does not matter that both the layers of subsidiaries are into operating companies. So in the current case where an Indian company is forming an SPV, and that SPV is then again either acquiring the 2 layers or forming these 2 companies, it will technically violate the company's rules, and therefore you may not be able to do it. So while under FEMA you have an SPV and under that couple of operating companies, which looks to be fine, but you may not be able to create such a structure because of the Companies Act restrictions. Here, many times, what many clients do is that they get this SPV, OPCO 1, OPCO 2 formed by another, group, and then they acquire the whole structure. So in the Companies Act, there is an exemption from this 2-layer restriction if you have acquired the whole structure. So of course, there are some ways and means to obviate the restrictions under the company's rules. But the point I wanted to make was that not just FEMA, but also the company rules need to be satisfied if you're creating multiple tiers, outside India. This one is again a very interesting structure. You have this whole controversy of, can you have one SPV or more than one SPVs? The regulations are silent. The FAQs refer to the term SPV. So if you go to an authorized dealer or an RBI, they typically say that, sorry, you cannot have more than one SPV. You may have multiple operating companies under that, we have no problem, but you cannot have multiple SPVs or multiple special purpose vehicles. In our current structure, we have 2 SPVs, SPV1 and SPV2, which is in blue. In practice, I have seen many companies going ahead, taking a council opinion and forming multiple SPVs. Of course, there is a pushback on multiple SPVs from a Reserve Bank perspective. Some of our clients had received notices, our clients had responded, and RBI has right now not taken any action. So this again is something which needs to be taken care of. If you want to play conservative, you better not have more than one SPVs overseas. But if you believe that no, these SPVs are necessaries, I need multiple SPVs, then of course your contention would be that nowhere under the regulations is it expressly written that you cannot have more than one SPVs. It's very interesting. One of the FAQs, which is FAQ 40 on ODI, says that there are no restrictions on having multiple operating companies. Interestingly, there is no FAQ which says that you cannot have more than one SPV. I don't know why Reserve Bank should have just issued that FAQ to make things clear. But by implication, it seems that the intention of Reserve Bank is that while I'm happy to permit multiple operating companies, I may not be comfortable having multiple SPVs. So of course, if you want to err on the side of caution, you will take a view that this multiple SPV structure, which are not operating companies, may not be possible under the ODI regulations. There is this again one more interesting point of an individual who was a non-resident. When he was a non-resident, he created a US company. Now that individual has come back to India and has become a resident. Now the US company wants to form a company in India. And can it be regarded as violation of LRS, because LRS doesn't permit you to invest in a company which has a step down subsidiary? Or can somebody say it's a round trip structure? And the answer to both is no, because the US company was formed when Mr. A was not a resident. So this company was formed not under the LRS route. So the LRS restrictions cannot apply even when Mr. A becomes a resident. So that's the first position. The second position is, as long as US company is using its own funds, which it created when Mr. A was a non-resident, to really invest back into the Indian company, the Reserve Bank cannot really say that this is a round trip structure, because the USCO was never formed under the ODI regulations. If USCO was formed under the ODI regulations, then there is a restriction, probably an implied restriction, to not invest back into India. But since this USCO was formed absolutely under, as I said, a non-LRS, non-ODI regime, today that USCO, it seems, can do whatever it wants. It can invest back into ICO and there should not be any violation of any regulations. So again, the residential status of that individual plays a major role on the overall structure. This is the last case study, which effectively is that many times you have operating companies outside, and there are some surplus money lying, and you want to use that surplus money into mutual funds and other liquid funds and all. And the question is that, can somebody say that you are now carrying out a financial activity? Typically, till now, the stand being taken is that if these investments are out of surplus funds and there is no systematic investment into the financial services sector, then nobody can take a contention that there is also a financial service activity happening, which is not prohibited under the operating company route. So this, of course, is fact driven, has to be done very, very carefully so that there is no violation of regulation 7 of the ODI regulations. And you continue to contend that no, this is only an operating company into non-financial services sector, and these investments are nothing but because they are surplus funds. I am investing, for a temporary period into liquid funds, mutual funds, etc. So that kind of fact pattern will need to be created under this regulation. One last thing, I think, which is this FEMA and income tax. The whole question sometimes is that when an Indian company incorporates a foreign company, is that a transaction I need to justify under transfer pricing? Because I might be investing into my own, wholly owned subsidiary. And could there be any transfer pricing implications? There have been some controversies where tax officers have been taking a view that yes, it's an international transaction. The correct view seems to be that since an investment into an overseas company should not create any taxable income, the rigors of the transfer pricing regulations should not apply. But because there are certain reporting related penalties, better to disclose it under your Form 3C EB, while you may not do any specific benchmarking, etc. So that's an interplay between your outbound investment and the Indian transfer pricing regulations. So these are some few case studies I thought might be of practical utility. We are through, and happy to take up questions. We still have 10 minutes left.
Yes, please. First question is from Mr. Sunil Agarwal. Can a listed CIC company invest in overseas under ODI route?
No, and a listed CIC can definitely invest. The question is that will that listed CIC invest in the financial services sector or in the operating sector? In practice, if the listed CIC in India is engaged into operating activities, which is the case most of the time you have, let's say somebody like a Piramal, which is a holding company, and you have pharma companies under it. They typically take a view that I will invest under Regulation 6 and I will invest in non-financial services sector. The challenge happens for a CIC that if it intends to invest in what you call a financial services sector outside India, then it has to be registered with RBI, which most of these CICs are not, because these are unregistered CICs per se. So depending on the fact pattern, it is most likely that a listed CIC can invest into the operating ODI window under the auto rule.
Okay, so next question is from Mr. Anil Kumar from HDFC Bank. Let's say there is a company A and there is a company B. Now company A is a holding company of company B, right? Company B is into financial sector, but company A is not into financial sector. But at the same time, major business of company A is through its subsidiary company B. Now this company A, this parent company A, intends to invest under ODI, right? So whether does this parent company needs to fulfill the requirements under financial segment?
If this company A, which is the holding company for the financial services business, if this company A intends to invest in the financial services sector, then it does need to satisfy the requirement of Regulation 7, which means that it also should have been registered with a financial regulator. It should have a track record of 3 years, etc., etc., and it should have, fallen under what you call NBFC or other local regulations applicable to it. Most of the time, such holding companies are not registered in India with any financial regulator. So these entities are not permitted to invest into the financial service sector under Regulation 7. We have made 1 or 2 applications in the past, it has got rejected. Reserve Bank said, sorry, no exception. I'm okay to give an exception that you are not regulated by the foreign country financial regulator because of the local regulations, but I will not dispense with the requirement of you being regulated in India again under a financial regulator. That apparently seems to be a very rigid condition which Reserve Bank is sticking to.
Ravi, next question.
Next question is from Mr. Vinayak. A gift of shares of a foreign entity to an Indian party or a resident individual, is it not require does not require an RBI approval or going to AD Bank, as many of the startups are being advised by foreign lawyers to incorporate foreign entity in the name of foreign lawyer first, and then the shares of such foreign entity will be gifted to Indian party or the resident Indian. Once this is done, the Indian party or the resident Indian will be owning 100% of the foreign entity, and the foreign entity will then incorporate a wholly owned subsidiary in India, and the whole structure will not come under round tripping, as the ODI is not required to be registered. So basically, rather than sending the ODI money, they are saying to invest through this route.
No, so I am aware of these structures, and technically what the person has said is right, because the investment has not happened under ODI or LRS. So very technically, there is no restriction for the foreign company to invest back into the Indian company. But whenever we have debated that extensively with councils, their only point is that the gift should look to be a bona fide gift. If the gift is not bona fide, then under the smell test, this structure may fail. But today, half such structures are blessed by gifts from foreign lawyers who have suddenly become your best friends, in the last few months, etc. So time will tell whether these structures are sustainable or not. But if today one were to plan this, I think the caution one needs to take is that not a foreign lawyer, but can you find your foreign partner, a close relative who is able to give, because the key transaction is the gift of shares. Which has to be seen as bona fide.
All right. Deepak ji?
Yes, please.
Shall I take the next one?
हाँ आप ले सकते हैं, कोई दिक्कत नहीं है.
I think you have covered this, but still I would like to bring this up by Mr. Aditya. Whether a minority investment into an Indian subsidiary by a US company which has 10% investment by a resident individual will also be covered under round tripping?
No, so there are two challenges. See, under round tripping, it is more easier to argue that this investment back into India was not initiated by me as an Indian investor, because I have no control over the decisions being made by the foreign company. So I think it is fairly safe to say that maybe Reserve Bank would be satisfied, because I was just a 5-10% shareholder into the US company, which then invested back into the Indian company. So there was no way I would have had any control. While it's a gray area, I have seen people going and taking that view. Seems to be quite tenable. The challenge is under LRS, because if the investment into the US company is under LRS, then the LRS says that the US company will not have any step down investment. If US company already had an investment in India, then I think I I couldn't have made this investment from India under LRS at the inception itself. But if once I have made an investment under the US company, and then the US company is making a step down investment, the legal question which arises is that can the US company at all make it, or what? And what do I do? Because the way the regulations are worded under LRS, they are saying that the US company shall not be permitted to make a step down investment. And it is not just about India. Even in US, they incorporate another US company and they invest. Can the Indian regulations really, govern the US company which are controlled by US shareholders? Uh, uh, a better view seems to be that you cannot have an extraterritorial application of your laws on a US shareholder controlled or foreign shareholder company. And therefore, in practice, where we have encountered one such case, we have advised that individual investor to write to the authorized dealer that when I invested, there was no such step down investment. Now they have made a step down investment absolutely outside my control. You kindly advise whether I would continue to hold the shares or any other actions have to be taken. And nobody has responded, so we are just keeping mum about it. I suspect that if RBI were to look at it, RBI would say, okay, no problem. When you did it, you were not aware, so maybe you retain the shares. But today, at least I am not aware of any precedents. While many such structures exist, where after investment under LRS, the foreign company made a step down investment, be it in India or abroad.
Sir, I myself have a follow-up question on that.
Yes.
Let us take an example of Facebook, wherein Facebook has a step-down subsidiary in India also.
Yes.
And Indian investor through LRS route can buy shares of Facebook as an investor.
Yes, the only difference is that investment has not happened under the ODI regulation. It's a portfolio investment. There, the requirement or the restriction of a step-down investment doesn't apply.
No, I'm saying I have made an investment under LRS only. Let's say a person has made an investment under LRS and acquired shares of a listed company outside India, which either already had a step-down subsidiary in India or subsequently made a step-down subsidiary in India.
Yes. So Ravi, that doesn't matter, I'll tell you, because when you see under LRS, there are two routes of investment. One is you are investing into a portfolio investment. So when you invest into a company like Facebook, that's clearly a portfolio investment. A portfolio investment doesn't have a require or a restriction of any step down subsidiary, etc. The restriction of having a step down investment comes under the ODI regulations read with LRS, where under the LRS, you are making a strategic investment.
Okay.
And therefore, if I were to invest in Apple, Facebook, knowing they have subsidiaries in India, that's not a problem. But if I were to create my own technology company or get into a joint venture with some party under the LRS read with ODI regulations, then those restrictions of having a step down subsidiary kicks in.
Okay, got it, sir.
So Ravi, I think we should wrap up this session.
Yes.
Yeah, Vishal bhai, I have a question.
Yes.
There are many jurisdictions where you don't need to remit the money in case of an ODI investment. Example, a lot of the free trade zones in Dubai,
Yes.
they basically allot the shares and they don't even ask for you to pay the money. In that scenario, how does it operate actually? It's very typical situation we have observed in many cases actually.
Yes. So there is a FAQ which says that you cannot receive unpaid shares. So it's not coming out from the regulation, but there is this FAQ 61 or something under ODI. So if I've invested under the ODI regulations, it could be LRS read with ODI also, and I have received shares, but these are unpaid shares, then apparently the FAQ is prohibiting it. But interestingly, there are some jurisdictions where you can create a company without a share capital. So if, for example, Singapore is one example, there are a couple of European countries where you create a company, but you don't issue the shares at all. And therefore, in the context of Dubai, if there are any zones where you can create a company without the zone issuing you any share, then maybe you may not fall foul of that FAQ. The challenge is on the reporting, because if no shares are issued, you have not remitted the money, and the company has formed. And one day, which could be after 6 months, you are now remitting the money for the first time. There you have to write the date of incorporation of the company. And there, if you write the date of incorporation being 6 months back, the authorized dealers get utterly confused that you are sending the money today and how has the company been created. So
Right.
there are these anomalies, but I think unpaid shares apparently seems to be prohibited because of that FAQ, which of course was not there last year.
Right. Okay.
And I believe, Vishal, even in US, in certain states, you can create LLCs or even S corporation or INC corporations without having any paid up capital.
Yes, because there it's a concept of a common stock, no shares are there.
Exactly.
It's more a contract. You are right, absolutely.
Particularly in Delaware, I have seen many companies where there is no requirement for paid up capital.
Right, right.
So with this, we wrap up this session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vishalji, for a wonderful session today on ODI. Now, I would like to invite Samba Murthy to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Deepak Bhai. Now, for asking me to propose vote of thanks to today's speaker, Vishal Gada sir. First of all, I wish you all a very happy Independence Day. Today's topic, ODA regulations in FEMA, was explained in a most detailed and lucid manner, which has made the complex provisions being understood in a very simple and easy manner. And the presentation has comprehended the critical issues of the subject with utmost clarity. Further, the case studies and the replies to the queries raised by the participants, including the panelists, enlightened all of us with a practical approach and additional knowledge stuff. It shows the depth of knowledge of our speaker, and we thank the speaker for immediately accepting our request and his wholehearted intellectual transfer. At this moment, I am just reminded of a small episode from Mahabharata. We all know that Duryodhana and Arjuna went to seek help of Sri Krishna before the Kurukshetra war. Sri Krishna was sleeping and two chairs were there, one besides his head and another besides his legs. Duryodhana thought that sitting near the legs is not correct for a king and hence sat at head side, whereas Arjuna without hesitation sat at on the side of leg side. Subsequently, the story everybody knows. How the story is related to today's topic, I will just explain. For our professionals, day-to-day working is just like a Kurukshetra with the expansion of the activities. And for this, we need to be updated with knowledge. And for this purpose, never become headstrong with your limited knowledge, but rather enhance your knowledge by doing Pada Seva, which means meaning knowledge, knowing and respecting your professional skills. Frequently and constantly and harness your skills with updation. Then everybody will become an Arjuna to win our day-to-day practice Kurukshetra. Thank you, Vishal Bhai, for showing the way to understand the topic as Arjuna, which I think is rightly captured by all the participants. I, along with FETAP and HSG of CTC and all participants, thank you for today's session and request all to join me in recognizing his contribution with a well-deserved round of applause. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vishal Bhai. It was really
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Really
thanks.
enjoyed it.
Thank you, Vishal.
Thank you.
We have one more thing to present. Deepak ji, please go ahead.
Sure. You have to give me 2 seconds, right?
Yes.
Just a sec.
Deepak ji, can you open my video?
Sir, you can.
No, I think it is showing the host as.
Just a sec. Let me see, sir. Okay. So can you
Yeah,
start?
okay, now it start. Yeah.
Right.
Even mine, Deepak ji.
Sure, sir.
On Independence Day, it should be colorful, Deepak ji.
Yeah.
Did I share it with you, Ravi?
No, I think you only have it.
Just a sec. I don't know where I stored it. So let me suggest. Okay. 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 Where it is being stored. Okay. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Mr. Doshi, would you do the honors, please?
Yeah, thank you. Vishal bhai, this is a very unique concept by the FTAP and CTC, Hyderabad Study Group. We are giving you an online e-appreciation certificate. Maybe in future we will have a physical meeting where we'll call you as a speaker. But in
Sure.
the temporary pandemic situation, we are presenting you a well-deserved certificate of appreciation for giving your complete knowledge. And somebody said IPR transfer has taken place from you to all the delegates. So thank you very much, Vishal. In spite of your travel schedule.
Very innovative. Very
Yeah,
innovative.
yeah,
Thank
very
you.
innovative. Absolutely. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much, Vishal. Even though you are traveling, you could make it and you could do it. Right?
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Vishal.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Vishal
Thank
ji.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.
So with this, our today's sessions come to an end. We will meet next Friday, and videos for days 6, 7, and 8. We will try to share them as soon as possible. With this,
Dipakji, one announcement from
show
HSG.
please. Show please.
We on Tuesday, this Tuesday, that is 18th evening, we have a session by T. Banushekar on the topic of penalties under Income Tax Act. The recent penalties would be covered there. So I request of all of you who are interested to please register on that portal of ctconline.org. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and wish you all happy Independence Day. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.